Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. So, before I start to the topics that we will be discussing or learning in this recorded discussion, I want you all to review your CMA syllabus and particularly on part one. Okay, so you were able to discuss with Mrs. Paklihan the other topics there. So my topics revolve around internal controls. So you can see here internal controls second to the last item under part one. So you can see their internal controls. This topic is actually 15% of the entire topics covered sa inyong CMA exam. So let's look at the specific topics or subtopics under the internal controls. So again, we focus on internal controls and here are the following topics. So for internal controls, we have governance, risk, and compliance, and system controls and security measures. Under governance, risk, and compliance, we have five minor topics: the internal control structure and management philosophy. We have internal control policies for safeguarding and assurance, internal control risk, corporate governance, and external audit requirements. And for the second topic, which is system controls and security measures, we have five subtopics. First, we have general accounting system controls, application and transaction controls, network controls, backup controls, and business continuity planning. So if ever you want to recall what topics are we going to discuss from this point up to finals, you can just visit imanet.org and you can see there a copy of the syllabus so you can browse it through so you will have an idea what we will be discussing next. But for this recorded discussion, we will simply focus on internal control structure and management philosophy. Let me just share my handout. Okay. So this handout was already uploaded in Canvas. For those who are not under me in Canvas, I actually asked Mrs. Paklihan to upload this handout for you. Let's begin. So again, this is under governance, risk, and compliance, particularly internal control structure and management philosophy. So section E, as what we've seen a while ago, this is under section E of part one. Section E comprises 15% of the CMA part one exam. And section E is composed of two parts, as what we've seen in the CMA syllabus. So we have governance, risk, compliance. The second is system controls and security measures. So I suggest before you continue watching this recorded discussion, just pause it first and then get your own copy of the handout so you can make notes as we move along the discussion. You can actually highlight the PDF, insert some notes. Okay, so just pause the video and continue when you are ready. All right, so internal control examines the controls that the company has developed and implemented to achieve its objectives. So we should be able to remember that the main purpose, the major purpose of why a company has internal controls is for the company to achieve its objectives. So in order for the company to be able to achieve whatever objectives that they have, they need to install internal controls. They need to have an internal controls in place. So the purpose of internal control is often perceived as being to prevent something from going wrong, but controls are really set up to assist the organization in the achievement of its objectives. So most people would actually think that internal control is there to prevent something from going wrong. So for example, we do not want our cash to be subject to theft. Di mi ganahan nga makawat among kwarta. So mao nang dapat among ibutang ang internal controls. Dapat na ay internal controls. But that is a wrong concept. Internal control is not really there to prevent something, to prevent a bad scenario, but rather control is there in order for the organization to achieve its objectives. So it must be clear in your mind that the main purpose of internal control is to achieve the objectives of the organization or the company. So it is very important to be familiar with the objectives of internal control. Two of the most important elements of internal control are the following. So we have segregation of duties and the elements that make up the components of internal control. I'm sure you've heard these terms several times. No, segregation of duties. You were able to hear it, I think, for the first time when you had your subject for accounting information system. This has been discussed thoroughly in that subject. And then we also have elements that make up the components of internal control, which we will discuss in detail later on. So you need to understand the concept of segregation of duties and what are the components of internal control. So later we will get to know them again. I say again because I know that you have heard of these topics before. It is important to know these topics and the other internal control topics not only from an academic standpoint, such as, for example, definitions and lists, but also from a practical application standpoint. So we are learning this not because kailangan jud siya or bookish siya nga concept, but rather we can really use these learnings that we have with regard to internal controls in the actual business scenario. So if you are to build a company in the future, you have to remember the concepts of internal control. You have to carry it with you. Okay? Or if even if you don't have a business but you plan to become part of the management team because diba, you are planning to take CMA, so managerial accountant or management accountant. So that means that you are there to help the management team make sound decisions and to help them to help the management come up with the best strategies that would achieve the company's objectives. You need to be able to understand and apply the concepts of internal control. So the answers to the application related questions in the future, if I will be giving them, can be very difficult because it may seem that all of the choices are good controls or none of the duties are ones that can be performed by the same person. So medyo tricky siya ang mga questions related to internal control. Kaya usahay mong gulinig basa nimo sa choice letter A, choice letter B, choice letter C, choice letter D. Feel nimo ma-apply siya tanan. No, kani nga control mo rag pwede man ni siya ani nga scenario, but we need to be able to have a good grasp of the knowledge of internal control so we can pick which control is best for this type of scenario. So the internal controls of a company are an important part of its overall operations. So even if hindi kaya mong business idea, even if well laid out na imong marketing plan, but if you lack internal control, you have internal control in place, then it would be very difficult for you to achieve your goal, which is, I think, to earn more profits, higher profits the better. A strong internal control system will provide many benefits to a company, including the following. So if we have internal controls in place, then we could reap the following benefits. We can lower the external audit costs because if we have a good internal control, that means that the internal control risk, diba, as part of the audit risk, remember, audit risk is equal to inherent risk times control risk times detection risk. So if we have good internal controls, meaning control risk will be low. If control risk will be low, detection risk is high. If detection risk is high, what does it mean? it means that the scope of work of the auditors will be very limited na lang. Gamay na lang ilang trabahoon. So kung gamay na lang ang trabahoon sa auditors, that means gamay na lang sa taong bayranon nila. So lower external audit costs. Better control over the assets of a company. So dili siya susceptible to theft if natay kwarta, dili siya taas og chance nga makawat. If natay other assets, dili pud siya high chance nga magamit for unauthorized purposes. And then reliable information for use in decision making. A company with weak internal controls is putting itself at a risk for employee theft, loss of control over the information relating to operations, especially if um, you are holding trade secrets. For example, if you have a good product and then recipe, let's say for that product is considered as a trade secret, if wala mo internal control, there is a chance that your secret recipe, for example, your trade secret will be leaked to other persons. And other inefficiencies in operations and decision making that can damage its business. So at this point, klaro na no nga, importante gud kaayo ang internal control. If we do not have an internal control, or if we have an internal control but the internal control is weak, then we are exposing ourselves to a huge business loss. So who cares about internal control? Ever since commercial organizations, nonprofit organizations, and governments have existed, their leaders have recognized the need to exercise control in order to ensure that their objectives were achieved. So if you have objectives, dili ra man kamo stop nga pag-relay. Umao niya itong objectives, manadayon, dinandag ka manghilabot. So no, di ba, you need to properly monitor nga ang mga ginabuhat sa imong employees are actually those activities that would lead to the success of the company. So today, however, the leaders of an organization are not the only ones who care about its internal control policies and procedures. So sa una kuno, ang mo care ra kung naa ba internal controls, ang pag-implement sa internal controls is ang business, ang leaders lang sa organization. But now, dili lang ang leaders. When we say leaders, ang ato ang management team o ang ato ang DODs, dili lang sila ra ang mo care sa existence and implementation of the internal control. Example, for a public company, information on the effectiveness of its internal control system is important to investors to enable them to evaluate management's performance of its stewardship responsibilities as well as the reliability of its financial statements. So when we speak of public company, these are companies that are very huge. Diba? You learned in your corporation law that for a company to be considered a public company na siya asset threshold. Dapat ang iyang asset is at least 50 million, correct? So at least 50 million ihang assets. Unya dapat na siya at least 100 shareholders holding at least 200 shares. So meaning dako gyud siya nga company. So if it is a public company, not only the BOD and the management team is concerned with the company's internal control, but also the potential investors. So if you want to invest your money in this public company, you will also be able to concern yourself with whether or not this company has a good internal control. Because if na kwarta, why would you invest it into a company nga taas og risk nga mabankrupt, no? So dapat imong isure nga ang imong kwarta padung sa isa ka company nga naay nindot nga internal control, para if naay siya nindot nga internal control, this means that mas dako ang iyang profits nga makuha. What else? The company's external auditors also recognize that an audit of a company with effective internal controls can be performed more efficiently, as what I have explained a while ago. So if we have good internal control, that means control risk is low, which means detection risk can be higher. If detection risk is high, that means the work of the external auditors will be very limited. Gamay ra ang kailangan buhaton and magbuhat nila efficiently ang ilahang audit procedures. The potential for Philippine corporations to make illegal payments to foreign governments is of concern to legislative and regulatory bodies. So kinsa ko'y lain na I-care daw sa internal controls ang ato ang legislative and regulatory bodies. So for example, ang ato ang AMLA, so Anti-Money Laundering Authority. For example, they also want to check whether some of the Philippine corporations are making illegal payments to foreign governments, say for example, for illegal purposes such as human trafficking, kidnapping, or drugs. So the internal controls are there in order for the legislative and regulatory bodies to make sure that there are no such illegal payments made to other foreign entities. Compliance with legislation prohibiting such activities is addressed through internal control policies and procedures. The development of larger organizations with increased number of employees has made it necessary for management to limit and direct employees' authority and discretion through internal control policies and procedures. So, affected po ang ato ang mga employees. Okay? Katang mga rank and file employees, dili lang katong naa sa management na side. Even customers would also care about our internal controls. So customers have an indirect interest in internal controls because a strong internal control system may reduce the costs of production and therefore also reduce products prices. So if ikaw customer ka sa isa ka company, of course mamili jud kag someone or mamili jud kag company nga nindot ilang internal controls, because if nindot ilang internal controls, that means nindot pagkadala ang ilang company. So since nindot man pagkadala ang ilang company, then efficient ang ilang pagtrabaho. And since efficient ang ilang pagtrabaho, the product cost, no, ang cost sa pagproduce sa isa ka product nga imong palitonon from them will be much lower because there are lower risks of wastage or spoilage or mga damage or loss during production. So since gamay raman ang inefficiencies, if you have good internal controls, then you can come up with a lower product cost. So kung lower ang product cost, that means mas barato sad ang bayron nun sa customer. So now that we have these lessons on the importance of internal control, now that we have understood why is it important to have an internal control, let's define what is internal control. So internal control is a process. It is a process effected by an entity's board of directors, management, and other personnel designed to provide reasonable assurance regarding, so balik no, regarding the achievement of objectives. And these objectives relate to the operations, reporting, and compliance. So we actually have three main objectives. So objectives relating to operations. The second is reporting. And third is with regard to compliance. So based on this definition of internal control, we can see these several fundamental concepts. First, the purpose of internal control is to help the company achieve its objectives. Ako na ning gibalik-balik ha, so dapat di na ninyo makalimtan. Purpose is to achieve company's objectives. The objectives that the internal control applies to falls into three categories. Again, ang ato ang objectives na itulo ka buok: operations, reporting, and compliance. So operations. Operations objectives relate to the effectiveness and efficiency of operations, or the extent to which the company's basic business objectives are being achieved and its resources are being used effectively and efficiently. So for example, ang pinakanindot nga example aning operations objectives is if you can imagine a factory. So for example, the company is into manufacturing company siya. So ang iyang operations mag-revolve around the activities performed inside the factory. So ang kaning factory, di ba, maka-imagine mo na ay raw materials, ikuha siya from the warehouse. Unya, gi-convert siya into work in process. Then, once mahuman na siya, it becomes finished goods. So, as the raw material move along the production line, production process, dapat nindot ang iyahang pahimo, so from this material to this finished good. Dapat effective siya in a sense nga sakto gyud na achieve ang correct nga finished product. Efficient siya in a sense nga the raw materials are being used at its full capacity, meaning walay parts of material na nasayang or nababa during the production process. So, muna siya to ang operations objectives. Okay. Okay, next will be the reporting objectives. So, reporting objectives pertain to internal and external, financial and non-financial reporting. So when we speak of financial reporting, it can be internal and external. So for example, financial money, about na siya kwarta. So for example, the balance sheet of a company, the profit and loss statement or the income statement of a company, dapat reliable. So it could be internal or external depending on the purpose of reports. For example, internal for management use only or for BOD use only. External ni mga ibang sabi mo PIR sa SEC, no mo na siya itong external reports. And it could be financial or non-financial. So, non-financial is mga numbers gihapon pero dili about. So, for example, as turnover ratio, return on equity. So these are non-financials. How long do we pay for our accounts payable? How long do we collect the receivables from the customers? So those are non-financial items. Reporting objectives include reliability. So dapat ang mga reports nga ma-generate are reliable, no? Timely. So kung kanus kailangan dapat na jud dili late mahatag. No? Another objective is transparency. So you need to include disclosures. If na ay mga items dira nga kailangan i-explain nga, uy nganong inani man siya, dapat naa siya corresponding disclosure for transparency purposes. And other requirements as set forth by our regulators, recognized standard setters, or the entity's policies. Okay, compliance objectives relate. So another aspect or category of our objectives is compliance objectives. These objectives relate to the organization's compliance with applicable laws and regulations, encompassing all laws and regulations to which the company is subject. So, for example, if your business is a corporation, then you need to comply with the requirements of the Securities and Exchange Commission. If you have foreign investors, you also have to comply with the requirements under our Foreign Investments Act or FIA. If you are operating in an ecozone, within an ecozone, so you also have to comply with the requirements of PEZA, Philippine Economic Zone Authority. So, and other applicable laws. Okay, if you have, if you are into banking, you also have to comply with the requirements set forth by our BSP or Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas. So these laws and regulations establish minimum standards of behavior and may include marketing, packaging, pricing, taxes, environmental protection, employee safety and welfare, and international trade, as well as many others. So for example, for employee safety and welfare, if your company is a BPO company, then DOLE has specific requirements for you to comply with regard to employee safety and welfare, especially for those employees who are working at night. So kanang mga night shift. So dapat na mo comply ka. Naadira sa ato ang DOLE regulations nga kailangan na kay sleeping quarters, no, where your companies can take where the employees can take a rest during their breaks. So naa na siya yung mga list of compliance requirements. Okay, the three categories address different needs and they may be the direct responsibilities of different managers. So lahi-lahi nga objectives, lahi-lahi pod ang accountable persons ana. For example, for operations, dili man pwede nga si accounting manager accountable sa operational objectives. No. So dito na siya sa factoring aside, sa manufacturing aside. So lahi-lahi ang managers nga mag-handle ani nila. But every internal control should be directed toward the achievement of objectives in at least one and possibly more than one of the three categories. The three categories of objectives, katong ganina, operations, reporting, and compliance, are distinct from each other, but they do overlap most of the time. Therefore, a specific control objective for a specific company could fall under more than one category. So if we have one control objective, that control objective could be under operations or pwede siya ma-under sa reporting, pwede siya ma-add sa compliance. So pwede siya ma-fall sa more than one category. So for example, the reporting objective of ensuring reliable external financial reporting in accordance with our accounting standards, it also concerns the compliance objectives, no? So kani siya nga objective, mahug siya sa reporting objectives, mahug siya sa compliance objective. Okay, as established by standard setters. And for publicly held corporations complying with the SEC's reporting requirements in accordance with that body's regulations. So another very important concept based on the definition of internal control, it is a process. Internal control is a process. So internal control is an ongoing process. It is not something that can be done once and be completed. Oh, mao ni siya, okay na, dili. No, so it is continuous. It's a journey and not a destination. It consists of ongoing tasks and activities. It is a means to an end and not an end in itself. Next, internal control is effected or accomplished by people. So as you can see here, we have the board of directors, management, and other personnel. It is something that must be put into effect by people. It is not policies and procedures. It's not just a mere paper. Oh, mauna ni siya, internal control. After na, wala na dayon. No. It should be put into action by people. So people are located throughout the organization at every level, from the members of the board of directors, so from the top to bottom, to the staff. Simply writing policy manuals that call for internal control procedures is not enough. So to be effective, people must put policies and procedures into effect. And then internal control procedures can only provide reasonable assurance, as what we can see in the definition of internal control, designed to provide reasonable assurance. Okay, reasonable assurance only, and not absolute assurance. And it is not a guarantee nga wa joy bati nga mahitabo. So only reasonable assurance to the entity's board of directors and senior management that the company's objectives will be achieved in the three named areas. Katotong dimension kanina. This statement reflects the fundamental concepts that number one, the cost of an internal control system should not exceed the expected benefits. So kay dili man day siya makahatag og absolute assurance nga sure jud 100% nga ma-achieve ang company's objectives. So kay dili man day siya 100% absolute assurance but only reasonable assurance, you also have to take into account the cost of implementing internal control vis-a-vis its benefits. So imong timbang-timbangon. So if I spend this much for internal control, pila man ang akong ma-reap nga benefits. If the cost will outweigh the benefits, then dili worth it ang kaninga internal control. And the overall impact of a control procedure should not hinder operating efficiency. So, dili dapat siya hassle kayo to the point nga makahamper siya sa ato ang pag-perform sa ato ang mga duties within the organization. And then internal control must be flexible in order to be adaptable to the entity's structure. So, dili siya dapat fix nga. Pag sugod na to as a company mo niya to internal control, mo na din siya forever. No. It must adapt to the entity's structure. So, as the company grows, malahi po ang ato ang internal controls in place. Internal control needs to be adaptable to apply to an entire entity or just to a particular subsidiary, division, operating unit, or business process. So meaning, for example, the internal controls of a parent company is not necessarily the set of internal controls that would be applied to a subsidiary. No? So dapat mo tailored fit jud siya sa kaninga company. So for example, ang internal control of a banking corporation will not be applicable to a manufacturing corporation. So dapat lahi-lahi gid siya. It should adapt to the specific and unique structure of that company. Okay, so now that we know this, let's ask this question. Who is responsible for internal control? Kinsa man jud dapat ang ultimately responsible for the development and implementation of internal control? So it depends, okay? So it depends on which aspect or which perspective are you looking into. As to the oversight function, so responsible for overseeing the internal control system, that is your BOD. Oversight ang BOD. CEO is ultimately responsible for the internal control system and the tone at the top. So later we will get to know what is this so-called tone at the top. So this actually falls under our management philosophy ng topic because this is internal control structure and management philosophy. So ang tone at the top, diha na siya fall sa management philosophy. And then we also have senior managers. Okay? And then we have financial officers under staff. We have the internal auditors. Lahi-lahi na sila og mga responsibilities. And so, we can say that virtually all employees DI are involved in the internal control because all employees produce information used in the internal control system or carry out other activities that put the internal control systems into effect. Actually, appeal pud ang ato ang external parties. No, external parties provide information that is useful to effective internal control. So for example, independent auditors, 'di ba mga external auditors? Ang external auditors, these are considered as external parties. So the independent auditors who audit the financial statements provide other useful information as well to the management and the board. Other external parties include legislators, regulators, customers, financial analysts, bond rating agencies, and the news media. However, external parties are not part of the internal control system. Kaya ano? Di man nilang internal control system, internal. So, why labot ang external parties? So, external parties are not part of the company's internal control system and they are not responsible for it. So, the role ng external parties. Ang role sa external parties is to provide additional information to the management and or board. But in essence, they are not part of the company's internal control system. Okay, so this is part 1 of the lecture video. For part 2, we will be discussing components of internal control.